How long has the federal government been lying to you and me? Now, not necessarily entirely to the people who earn over $1 million a year and can figure this stuff out and read Fortune in the Wall Street Journal regularly, but to the average American. How long have they been lying to us in order to impoverish the middle class, wipe out people on Social Security, and destroy labor unions? I think it's a very appropriate question on this election day. It is, of course, Tuesday, the 20th of May, and tonight the returns will be coming in from Kentucky and Oregon. I'm broadcasting live here from Oregon. In fact, in the third hour of our show, Ellen Ratner is going to drop by. She's with the Talk Radio News Service. She's in town to report for her stations and whatnot live from Oregon about the Oregon returns. And it'll be great to see Ellen, Louise, and I'll go out and have some lunch with her afterwards. But how long has this been going on? I've had a number of people call into the program over the last 6 years, that we're now in our sixth year doing this program in this time period, noon to 3 Eastern time, and ask, how is it that people, in particularly on Social Security or on fixed incomes, pensions, things like that, say, how is it that I'm supposed to be getting a cost of living adjustment every year, and I do, and it's supposed to reflect inflation, but 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I could actually live on what that was, and now I can't anymore. Now I'm having to choose between medications and food, or between food and dog food, or pay the rent or live in the car kind of thing. I mean, how is that? How did it come about? In fact, there are some really startling statistics out there. Mike Whitney wrote this, and Danny Schechter quoted it in a piece over at Common Dreams, but Mike Whitney wrote this piece, and this sounds like, just total conspiracy nut stuff. He says, the financial crisis we now face was created by design. It was intended to destroy the labor movement, crush the middle class, quash Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and reduce our foreign debt by 50 to 60%, forcing a restructuring of America's debt, privatize all our public assets and resources, and create a new regime of austerity measures which will divert more wealth to the banking and corporate establishment. Fact of the matter is, he's right. There is no conspiracy nut to that. It's absolutely true. It was part of the Reagan agenda. It has been followed scrupulously since the Reagan administration. It was even done during the Clinton administration. And Kevin Phillips laid it out brilliantly, frankly, in an article that's in the current issue of Harper's. And this is the May 2008 issue of Harper's Magazine. It's called Numbers Racket by Kevin Phillips. And I highly recommend that you check this thing out. He points out, first of all, that over the last 25 years, the effect of rigged numbers, of jiggled numbers, the effect of this has been to make it seem like we're wealthier than we are. In fact, he says, just imagine what the political consequences would be. He says if the media over the past 5 years have been citing 8% unemployment instead of 5%, 5% inflation instead of 2%, and annual average growth in the 1% range instead of 3 to 4%, well, it would be political suicide for the party in power. And yet that's what it has been. When you look at the actual, real numbers, and he's got the charts and graphs here right now, if we were to use the criteria that was used in 1983, the second year of the Reagan administration, when the jiggling of these numbers really went on to steroids. So let's just go back to 83. You look at using the 83 way, the way that inflation was calculated from the 19-teens until 1983, today's inflation rate would be 12%. That's what the real inflation, but the government says it's only 4% per year. In fact, last year they were saying, officially it was less than 2%, when in fact last year it was just a little under 10%. Now, how do they get away with this? This is the other question that people often call in and ask. How is it the politicians get away with this? And again, I refer you to Bob Herbert's piece in today's New York Times, Bob Herbert's op-ed. He says, in this presidential election, let's hope it's not about Willie Horton or guns, gays, and God and that kind of thing. Let's talk about what's actually going on in America. Let's talk about the real serious economic issues. The slogan of the unofficial internal slogan of the Clinton campaign in 1992 was, "It's the economy, stupid." And it really needs to be again. But how did this come about? Well, Kevin Phillips lays it out, and it's absolutely startling. He talks about how in 2003, an economist from the University of Chicago, ironically enough, because this is where Milton Friedman is from, the guy who arguably began the economic insanity that Reagan brought with him to our country. Austin Goolsbee is his name. He's now an advisor to Barack Obama's presidential campaign. In 2003, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times pointing out that the government was, quote, cooking the books. And, the fact of the matter is they were. In some ways, this began in 1961. In 61, Kennedy looked at the unemployment numbers and said, is there some way to make these look better? By 63, the year he was assassinated, they actually put into place this thing where they came up with this term, discouraged workers. LBJ was said to scrutinize and sometimes tweak the gross national product. But this was small stuff. Even Nixon had his own taste for statistical improvement, writes Kevin Phillips. He asked his second Federal Reserve Chairman, Arthur Burns, to develop what became ultimately famous as the division between core inflation and headline inflation. So this was Nixon who came up with the idea that rather than have an inflation rate that actually reflected the cost of living for average Americans, we should take out the really volatile things like food and transportation because they vary so much. And with housing, instead of measuring what it costs to buy a house, let's measure rents because rents are not as affected by inflation. Rents are not as affected by housing bubbles. So let's measure rents. But Phillips writes, in 83, under the Reagan administration, statistics decided that housing, too, was overstated in the Consumer Price Index and it substituted an entirely different owner-equivalent rent measurement. That was what I just told you about. That was in 83. That was under Reagan. Simply sidestep what was happening in the real world of homeowner costs because low inflation encourages low interest rates, and thus we get our bubble. Hey, what a surprise. Phillips goes on to say the Reagan administration further trimmed the numbers by reclassifying members of the military as employed rather than considering them totally out of the realm of, employed or unemployed as had traditionally been the case. Then came George Herbert Walker Bush. He wanted to cut the number that, what looked like inflation. So his effort was to reduce the inflation rate in order to reduce federal payments from interest on the national debt to cost of living outlays for government employees, retirees, and Social Security. And then the Clinton administration, Kevin Phillips says, is one of the ones that implemented the actual convoluted CPI measurements that the first Bush administration came up with. So George Herbert Walker Bush proposed the changes so that people living on fixed income, Social Security, pensions, whatever it may be, things like that, where the cost of living is going to affect them, that those people would get less and less money over time, even though inflation was eating away at it more and more. George Herbert Walker Bush came up with it. Bill Clinton put it into place. This was in 1996. It was promoted by, guess who? Alan Greenspan. Read Ravi Batra's book, Greenspan's Fraud. So now you've got discouraged workers becoming a larger part of the workplace. In 94, again in the Clinton administration, they once again redefined discouraged workers and came up with this category of long-term discouraged workers, which dropped 4 million people off the rolls. Just like that. All of a sudden, it looked like employment in the United States was a whole lot better. And they also reduced their monthly household economic sample. They used to sample 60,000 people. And in 94, during the Clinton administration, they decided to drop 10,000 people from that sample, mostly people in low-income African-American neighborhoods. The result of this was that all of a sudden, during the Clinton administration, it looked like black unemployment got better, black standards of living got better, and the poor weren't as poor. Why was that? Well, it was because they went from sampling 50,000 people every year to sampling, or 60,000 to sampling 50,000. They dropped 10,000 people from the rolls, and guess who those people were? By and large, poor African Americans. So if you don't count them, they don't exist. And this is what we're left with now, is a real inflation rate of 12% right now, a real unemployment rate of 7, possibly as much as 10% right now, and real growth of less than 1%. At the same time, our businesses are being bought up by foreigners at a mind-boggling rate. We are turning into a third world country. This needs to be the issue of the election.